Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 8 of the Foundations in Kinematic Analysis lecture series. In the previous lecture, we learned how to calculate wrist speed, quantifying its change in position over time. We also identified the moment of peak speed for a given gesture stroke. Today, we're going to see whether a speaker's maximum gesture speed corresponds to changes in their speech amplitude, or their loudness. We call this speech gesture synchrony. Let's talk more about this phenomenon and how to measure it. For this lecture series, we define speech gesture synchrony as the precise temporal coordination between the speech signal and hand movements. However, people call this phenomenon by a lot of different names. For example, in the literature, you might also see words like entrainment, coupling, alignment, convergence, coordination, accommodation, and mimicry, describing a similar concept. All of these terms describe the phenomenon that communicative signals converge over time. Often this results in subtle, unintended changes in one modality because of changes in another. In this lecture series, we focus on speech gesture synchrony within a speaker, which is called intrapersonal synchrony. For example, we will examine how a speaker's gesture speed relates to changes in their speech loudness. However, you can also look at synchrony between speakers, and this is called interpersonal synchrony. For example, how two speakers align or repeat each other's speech and gesture behaviors over time. You can measure synchrony over different timescales. You can measure it at the level of a single word or gesture stroke, within an utterance, across two turns, or over the course of an entire conversation. The time frame you choose to analyze depends on your specific research question and study design. For an overview of different levels of behavioral alignment or synchrony between speakers, we refer you to this paper, which we'll link to in the description below. The term speech gesture synchrony implies that speech and gesture are related somehow. However, we can define the relationship between speech and gesture on multiple linguistic dimensions. First, speech and gesture can be related on the semantic dimension, conveying a related meaning. Let's take a look at a couple examples. This is a screenshot of an alien annotation file for one of our participants who says, "And my eyes are locked on a flyer on the wall." During this utterance, the participant produces two gestures that we would call iconic gestures because they visually represent semantic information in speech. In the first gesture, he is indicating the direction that his eyes are locked on, pointing back and forth between his eyes and a point straight ahead. In the second gesture, he is representing or placing the flyer on an imaginary wall with his open hand. When talking about the semantic relationship between speech and gesture, people sometimes use the word lexical affiliate to refer to the information in speech that is most semantically related to the information depicted by the gesture. So in these examples, we might consider eyes to be the lexical affiliate of the first gesture and flyer to be the lexical affiliate of the second gesture. We can even quantify the temporal synchrony between a gesture stroke and its lexical affiliate. For example, in both of these cases, the onset of the gesture stroke starts before the onset of the lexical affiliate by 150 to 350 milliseconds. One thing to notice is that although the gesture stroke onset occurs before the corresponding lexical affiliate, the strokes are still very nicely overlapped with semantic information in speech. It's possible that starting the stroke onset before the lexical affiliate onset might actually help to synchronize the apex and duration of the stroke with the relevant semantic information in speech. This paper by Ter Bekke and colleagues provides a thorough overview of the timing of gestures in relation to speech. they examined the temporal synchrony of hundreds of gesture strokes with lexical affiliates in naturalistic conversation, and they found that the majority of gesture strokes started before the lexical affiliate. In this figure, they plot the difference between the stroke onset and the lexical affiliate onset. So a value of 0 would indicate perfect speech-gesture synchrony, and negative values would indicate that the stroke starts before the lexical affiliate. Indeed, they found that the distribution is shifted in the negative direction, and that strokes tend to start around 200 milliseconds before the lexical affiliate. So this is one way to measure speech-gesture synchrony. Speech and gesture can also be related on the pragmatic level. They can share conversation regulating functions, such as managing turn-taking and regulating or structuring one's own or their partner's communication behavior. For example, they can be used to signal to hold or yield the floor, reflect shared knowledge, or guide the listener's attention. And speech and gesture can have a syntactic relationship. This refers to how gesture maps onto the grammatical structure of an utterance and the roles gesture takes within a sentence. For example, gestures can be synchronized with a specific lexical item in a sentence, like nouns or verbs, mirror the order of syntactic clauses, or align timing with syntactic boundaries. In this lecture, we'll focus mostly on the prosodic relationship between speech and gesture, which refers to how gestures align with the temporal and rhythmic features of speech, such as stress, intonation, and timing. So remember, in Lecture 6, we introduced the speech amplitude envelope, which is a smooth signal showing how the amplitude or loudness of the speaker's voice changes over time. In our analysis of speech-gesture synchrony, we will quantify the degree to which peaks in the loudness of the speaker's voice correspond to peaks in the speed of their gesture movements. So let's look at these two signals on the same timeline. The top plot shows the speech amplitude envelope, and the bottom plot shows the speed of the right wrist across the entire video. We want to know how these two waveforms correspond to each other during gesture events. To do this, we'll calculate speech-gesture synchrony for each gesture stroke. This is an example of the first gesture produced by this participant. We want to know, does the maximum volume of his voice correspond to the moment of maximum speed of his wrist movement? Let me play the example for you now.
The first week of college.
Now let's zoom in to look at the wrist speed and speech amplitude waveforms for this gesture stroke. As before, we see the speech amplitude envelope plotted in orange and the right wrist speed plotted in green. Time is on the x-axis, and you'll notice that we actually have two different y-axes. The left y-axis shows wrist speed, and the right y-axis shows speech amplitude. And this is because these measures are on different scales. If we look at the wrist speed signal, we see that there are 4 bumps in the speed, but the maximum speed peak is the first one, occurring during the word first. In the speech signal, we have 3 bumps, corresponding to each of the 3 content words in the phrase: first, week, and college. The maximum speech amplitude is also occurring during the word first. We want to know the temporal distance between the gesture speed peak and the speech amplitude peak during this gesture stroke. This analysis is called peak-to-peak analysis. In this example, we see that the peak, or maximum gesture speed in this time series, occurs at 1060 milliseconds, and the peak speech amplitude occurs at 1200 milliseconds. We can subtract the difference between these 2 time points. So we take peak speed minus peak amplitude, and that gives us a synchrony value of negative 140 milliseconds for this gesture stroke. This is an example where speech amplitude and gesture speed are quite closely synchronized, with the peaks occurring just 140 milliseconds apart. In our entire dataset, there are 181 gesture strokes produced by 8 participants. We can calculate the peak-to-peak speech-gesture synchrony for all of these strokes. Here we plot a histogram and density distribution of the speech-gesture synchrony values for every stroke in the dataset. The black vertical line at 0 milliseconds represents perfect synchrony, meaning that the peak gesture speed and peak speech amplitude occurred at exactly the same moment. We can see that our distribution is shifted slightly in the negative direction, which means that the gesture speed peak tends to occur before the speech amplitude peak. Across all strokes, the mean synchrony value is represented by the solid vertical line at negative 125.5 milliseconds. This distribution suggests that speech loudness and gesture speed tend to be relatively synchronized. Of course, there will be some exceptions. For example, in this stroke, the peak gesture speed occurred 2.5 seconds before the peak speech amplitude. In the Jupyter Notebook tutorial, we will show you how to quantify synchrony between speech amplitude and gesture speed using peak-to-peak analysis. However, it's important to note that a synchrony distribution by itself is not fully informative because some temporal alignment can occur by chance. Ideally, we would compare the observed distribution against a surrogate or false pair distribution created from unrelated speech and gesture time series. If the observed distribution is more strongly peaked around 0 than the surrogate distribution, it provides stronger evidence for speech-gesture synchrony. You could also compare the temporal synchrony distributions across 2 groups or conditions, depending on your research design, to see if synchrony is stronger in one context than another. If you're interested in learning more about the speech amplitude envelope, including different ways to extract it, the kinds of analyses you can do with it, and how it relates to prosodic and syllabic rhythm in speech, I recommend checking out this paper. There are actually many measures that you might consider when studying multimodal prosody, or the synchrony between the timing and rhythm of speech and gesture. For example, in speech, you might be interested in fundamental frequency or pitch, speech rate or vowel duration, syllable timing, intonational phrases, or speech kinematics of the lip, tongue, or jaw. In gesture, we focused on speed, but you could also look at derivatives of speed like acceleration and jerk. You could look at movement amplitude or distance, holds and submovements, which we'll be discussing in the next lecture, and movement rhythmicity. There are lots of interesting ways that you can study the temporal correspondence between speech and gesture. We encourage you to think more broadly about the timescales and measures you might want to use to quantify speech-gesture synchrony, again, depending on your research question. Let's take a quick look at some other papers that have examined speech-gesture synchrony. First, I want to share this methods paper, which provides a tutorial for how to quantify speech-gesture synchrony, but instead of using speech amplitude, they use speech fundamental frequency, which is how we perceive the pitch of the speaker's voice. This is another great resource for learning more about motion tracking methods and how to calculate speech-gesture synchrony. As another example, this study looked at native Dutch speakers who were learning Spanish and had them produce a single up and down beat-like movement while producing Spanish cognates that either matched the syllabic stress of the Dutch word or had a different stress pattern. For example, the word profesor in Spanish compared to professor in Dutch. They examined the temporal synchrony between the peak speech amplitude of the stressed syllable and the point of maximum vertical extension of the hand, and they found that foreign language learners' hand movements were shifted towards the syllable that would have been stressed in their native language, even when they placed the acoustic stress on the correct syllable. There are also some papers looking at speech-gesture synchrony in diverse populations, including psychiatric, neurodevelopmental, and acquired neurogenic language disorders. You can see some examples here examining multimodal synchrony in schizophrenia, aphasia, and autism. And finally, although this lecture is focused on peak-to-peak analysis between two time series waveforms, I want to briefly introduce another method to measure speech-gesture synchrony called cross-wavelet analysis. As before, here you can see the speech amplitude and the right wrist speed waveforms across the entire video. In cross-wavelet analysis, you can look at the relative phase of two signals, which examines whether they're going up and down together, and we can measure the degree of phase shift. For example, if a speaker's hand speeds up at the exact moment that their voice gets louder, the two signals would be in phase at 0 degrees. If one goes up while the other goes down, as you can see in the 180-degree phase shift, this is called antiphase. And of course, they can be somewhere in between. We can compare two time series using a sliding window. Rather than comparing just the peaks, this approach takes the full shape of both signals into account. To do the analysis, we introduce a mathematical tool called a wavelet. A wavelet is a short, wave-shaped template. We slide this wavelet across each signal separately, and at each moment in time, it tells us how much of a particular rhythmic pattern is present. We can do this at multiple timescales. Small wavelets detect fast rhythms, like individual syllables, and large wavelets detect slower rhythms, like gesture strokes or speech phrases. Then we compare the two wavelet decompositions, one for speech and one for gesture, against each other. And this is the cross and cross-wavelet analysis. It tells us whether the two signals are showing similar rhythmic activity at the same time and at the same scale. This topic is beyond the scope of this lecture series, but I want to share some papers that use cross-wavelet analysis to measure speech-gesture synchrony, and in the description below, we'll link to an EnvisionBox module providing a tutorial for how to do cross-wavelet analysis. I encourage you to look into these resources on your own if you're interested in learning more. And finally, this paper offers another approach to studying how two continuous signals co-vary over time across different rhythmic scales. The authors examined multimodal coordination between body movement and acoustics in speech and in musical performances. So instead of analyzing discrete events like gesture strokes, they analyzed changes in signal energy over time to capture the broader rhythmic structure. They found that sound movement synchrony was generally stronger in speech than in music. You can look at these examples if you're more interested in studying synchrony in continuous signals, rather than focusing on segmented moments like we do in peak-to-peak analysis. So now it's time to move on to our Jupyter Notebook tutorial, where we'll practice peak-to-peak speech-gesture synchrony analysis. Okay, let's navigate to the Lecture 8 script folder and open the Jupyter Notebook for this tutorial. Select your kernel and choose the KLS environment. In this notebook, we'll analyze the temporal relationship between gesture speed peaks and speech amplitude peaks. For each gesture stroke in our dataset, we will calculate the time difference between those two peaks. First, we'll set up our workspace. So let's run this first cell to import our required Python packages. Next, we'll read in the data from the CSV file we created in the previous tutorial in Lecture 7. This is the merged dataset that has all of the data streams we merged in Lecture 6 and the speed and velocity columns we added in Lecture 7. Run this code now, and you can see the preview below. And now we're ready to get started. This is the main section of this notebook. For every gesture stroke, we want to know when did the gesture reach its maximum speed, and within that same time series, when did the speech reach its maximum amplitude? Once we know those two time points, we can compare them. First, we are defining a function called findPeakInfo, which finds the highest value in a data series and returns its value in corresponding time. Then we specify the columns we'll be examining for peaks, which include the speed right wrist, speed left wrist, and speech envelope column. Then we loop through every unique video and stroke ID and compute the peaks for gesture speed and speech amplitude using the function we just defined. For speed peaks, it considers whether the gesture was produced by just the right hand, just the left hand, or both hands, based on the value in the hand column of our data frame. So, if it was a two-handed gesture, it finds the maximum speed produced by either hand. And if it was a one-handed gesture, it only looks at the active hand. Then we create a new variable called Synchrony MS, which we calculate as the peak gesture speed time minus the peak speech envelope time. Finally, we return a data frame that stores the results and display it below. We are also using the describe function to print some descriptive statistics. You can run this code now. In the data frame preview, each row corresponds to a single gesture stroke identified by the stroke ID column. For each stroke, we see the value of the peak gesture speed in units per second, the time in milliseconds when the peak speed occurred, the peak speech amplitude envelope value, the time point when the speech amplitude occurred, and the Synchrony MS column, which displays the temporal distance between the two peaks in milliseconds. Remember, a synchrony value of 0 would mean that the gesture speed and speech amplitude peaks occurred at exactly the same moment. For the first gesture, the synchrony was negative 200 milliseconds, which means that the gesture speed peak occurred 200 milliseconds before the speech amplitude peak. If we look at the summary descriptives, we see that there were 181 gesture strokes in total, and the mean synchrony value was about negative 125 milliseconds. You can also see the standard deviation, min, max, and quartiles. Now, let's visualize the results of our synchrony calculations. First, we're going to visualize a single gesture stroke. At the top, I've defined the name of one of the videos and which stroke ID I want to look at. You can change these values to explore other strokes. From the data frame summary we just created, we'll store the peak speed time and the peak envelope time for that specific stroke. And then from the big motion tracking data frame, we'll grab the time series of rows for that stroke. Within that time series, we will plot the right wrist speed and the speech amplitude curve over time. And then we'll add vertical lines for the peak speed and peak envelope time points. Run this now, and you can see where the peaks are located within the time series curves. In this case, the synchrony is very close to 0, with the peaks being only 20 milliseconds apart. As in the previous tutorial, we're going to use our grouping variable to compare whether gesture synchrony values differ for speakers in the pattern compared to no pattern groups. We will plot the two groups in different colors using a histogram plot and density curve. You can run this now, and in the plot below, we indicate perfect synchrony at 0 with the dashed vertical black line. Again, we see a lot of overlap in the distributions of these two groups, with the peaks of both groups close to 0. For the final step, we're going to merge our new synchrony results with the previous stroke kinematics data frame we generated in Lecture 7. This is where we are storing an ongoing file of our kinematics results per gesture stroke. We will read in the gesture stroke data frame from our output folder in Lecture 7, which we'll call stroke DF, and then we will merge it with the stroke summary data frame from this lecture with the Synchrony results, which is called peak DF. We'll save this updated version to the Lecture 8 output folder. Run this now, and now when we view the output, we see all of our unique stroke IDs, the mean and max speed from Lecture 7, and then the peak gesture speed, peak speed time, peak amplitude envelope, peak envelope time, and synchrony values from this lecture. And you should notice that the peak speed we calculated in this lecture is actually the same as the max speed values from the previous lecture. We just calculated it a slightly different way. And that's the end of this notebook tutorial. I want to remind you that we consider speech and gesture to be synchronous when temporal distance between the peaks are close to 0. But right now, these results are just descriptive. If you want to show stronger evidence for speech-gesture synchrony, you might statistically compare distributions between different experimental conditions or groups, or compare the observed distribution to a false pair distribution of unrelated speech and gesture time series. We looked at gesture speed and speech amplitude, but as I mentioned in the lecture, there are other measures of speech and gesture that you might be interested in measuring synchrony between. So I hope you find this useful as a starting place and continue exploring. In this lecture, you learned how to quantify the synchrony between a speaker's peak speech amplitude, how loud their voice is, and their peak gesture speed, how fast their hand is moving. We were able to quantify synchrony for each gesture stroke in our dataset and visualize the distribution of synchrony values. In this lecture, we focused on the temporal dynamics between the speech and the gesture signal. In the next lecture, we quantify the temporal dynamics of the gesture movements themselves by looking at how the movement signal is segmented. For example, we will identify if there are multiple sub-movements within a gesture by examining how the hand speed changes over time. And we'll also identify gesture holds, or moments when the hands are active but their movement is paused. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.